Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you're all having a wonderful weekend. Today is Sunday, September 20th, and I have had a wonderful week prior because guess what? I made it to the movies. I went to the movies for the first time since March, and yes, it was very exciting, and I'm very happy to talk about it. So, what movie did I see, you ask? I saw Tenet. I was very excited to see Tenet, and so that's the first movie I'm going to be talking about today. So my weekly watch, because of that, one of the only Nolan movies I had not seen was Batman Begins, so that's what I checked out for my weekly watch. And then my weekly recommendation is going to be my favorite Nolan movie, very Christopher Nolan day, and that one is Memento. And then stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I just thought that I would talk about the movies. I would talk about what it's like going to the movies now. I know a lot of you are probably not willing to risk it yet, and I completely understand that. I was kind of in that boat. I wanted to be very cautious about it, and so I thought I'd just run down what it's like going to the movies. The time I had there, it's going to be a little bit of kind of a free-form segment, just having fun at the end and talking about it. So if you don't want to go or just want to know what it's like to see if you would like to go, we'll talk about it together. And that's the episode. I hope you're excited. But we're going to start off with Tenet. Now let's get started. All right, so Tenet. I am thrilled to be able to go back to the movies. I felt like it was very safe. We'll get into that a little bit later. But I was very excited to see this movie. It had been on my list of wanting to see it. I mean, regardless of when this had happened, this was something that had been announced for a long time. It was going to be released earlier in the summer as kind of a summer blockbuster. And so even before the pandemic hit, I was excited to see it. I'm a very big Christopher Nolan fan. I wouldn't say that I'm as big a fan as some people. I'm not like a Nolan fanboy, but at the same time, I have enjoyed almost all of his movies that I've seen. So I was very curious to check this one out. I think Nolan has been on a little bit of a downward trajectory since Inception, maybe, but that also might just be public perception kind of influencing my thoughts. But in trying to make this show more casual, I do kind of want to just casually talk about this a little bit. I will still be hitting the main points of a review of what I like to talk about, but I've not been able to talk about this film with anybody because nobody around me has seen it. Nobody's gone to the movies. So I'm just excited to kind of articulate all my thoughts. I've got a lot to say about this, or at least I think that I do. And so, yeah, let's get started with the plot. So basically it follows John David Washington, who plays the protagonist, and it follows our protagonist after a botched mission of some sort. He has to take a suicide pill. It ends up being a fake suicide pill, so he gets into a medically induced coma and then eventually gets out of it to get out of the situation. And because the rest of the world believes that he is dead, he is now a part of a secret organization called Tenet, where he is tasked in finding out about and stopping an unknown threat to prevent the end of the world. Very high stakes here. There's a lot that I liked about this movie, so I will say up front that I really enjoyed the movie the entire time. There are some things that definitely set it back for me. It's one of those movies, I'm sure a lot of you have this, where I'm almost more frustrated and a bit more critical because I think it could have been excellent. It could have been almost perfect if a few of these things had been fixed. And because I'm so captivated by the story and I think the premise is just so cool, that I'm much more disappointed with the things that set it back, as opposed to just being like, okay, I can write it off because I didn't like certain aspects of the movie. But I think it just could have been probably one of Christopher Nolan's best if some of these things had been changed. So let's start by talking about some of the stuff that I did like, and that comes within the acting and the screenplay. So John David Washington plays the lead character, who is only known as protagonist, and he does a fantastic job. He's such a commanding leading man. So I'd only really seen him in BlacKkKlansman, which he has another extremely compelling and dynamic performance. And in this one, the performance is much more, I would say, laid back, maybe. It's a bit more rigid, if anything, compared to BlacKkKlansman, because BlacKkKlansman is caked with a bit more emotion. I do think there's a bit of similarity here, because in BlacKkKlansman, he has to play a character who is trying to be as calm and collected as possible, and that's similar in this movie. There's not really any need for emotional range in a lot of the scenes. He is supposed to be impartial, and that's how he's supposed to be acting in a lot of these scenes. So you want to have a very stoic leading man, and ultimately that's what he does. But he does offer a layer of depth, not necessarily in emotion, but just in overall charisma. There are scenes where he kind of just has to have a conversation. He doesn't really have to show any emotion in that conversation. He has to articulate a lot of these exposition-based plot points to the audience, and then also to other characters, or someone's articulating it to him and he's just sort of reiterating it or whatnot. But he's just very cool, very casual in a lot of those scenes, and it really just makes for just a very pleasurable performance to be watching, because it's just sort of your suave action hero, very similar to James Bond. But I just really liked a lot of what he brought to the table as a leading man. And so seeing him in this and seeing him in BlacKkKlansman, I would be very excited to see him as the main character in a bunch of movies to come. And I can see him eventually leading a franchise at some point. I'd be very surprised if that doesn't happen. But there's also some other great characters in this movie, or I would say great actors, maybe not great characters. There's just not a lot to these characters overall. And I'll get to that more in the screenplay. But ultimately, the story is much more important than the character, so I'll just start by saying that. And so the characters don't have all that much depth or backstory that we are aware of, or if they do, it's fairly surface level, just based on like other relationships in their life, so we can have a little bit of an emotional hook for them and a little bit of empathy. But Robert Pattinson and Elizabeth Debicki are the primary side characters, or just main side characters, and both of them have very good performances. Robert Pattinson has been in so much that I forget that he's British. So like seeing him in this, he's another very like cool character, similar to Protagonist. But the only main difference is he's a bit more experienced. First of all, you can tell that from the beginning he knows a bit more than Protagonist does, but I think he's also just a bit more like sly. He has kind of this bounce in his step in a lot of these scenes, and so some of it is treated with a little bit of humor. I wouldn't say there's not really any jokes in it. He doesn't actually say anything overtly funny, but he's just treating everything a bit lighter than John David Washington is, which is definitely a very intriguing thing to see juxtaposed with each other in the scene. I also really like Elizabeth Debicki in this. I've not really seen her in anything save for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and that's a pretty limited role. But in this, she has a really great emotional arc, or she just has a really great story arc, but then she has a really solid emotional hook for the story, and it's kind of our only insight into any form of like human emotions throughout the movie. It's just a very analytical story-based movie, and so having that outlet, she delivers a fantastic performance in a lot of ways. So she is sort of that stoic, cold character in a lot of scenes, but then she also has just very emotional, vulnerable scenes when she is faced with more emotionally taxing events than maybe some of these other characters might be, or at least that we can perceive them being based on what we know about their character. And so I think she has a phenomenal performance, particularly compared to the other two, because it's such a different performance. I also mentioned that I forgot that Robert Pattinson was British, and so I thought it was funny that I kind of thought he was American, even though I know he's not because he was in the Harry Potter series, but whatever. I just had it in my head that he was American, and then Himesh Patel is in this as well, and you might know him from Yesterday. And as far as I'm aware, he's also British, because that's the accent that he does in Yesterday, so I would assume, I feel like it'd be weird if that wasn't the case. He has an American accent in this, which, first of all, is a very good American accent. I thought he did a killer job there, because he's kind of just exposition. He doesn't really have a lot of, like, nuance in his character at all, but he does a great accent. And then I also thought that Robert Pattinson was American, so I thought it was weird. Like, I thought everyone was doing accents that weren't theirs, which isn't really the case. It's just Himesh Patel, so that's kind of a side note, but I thought it was funny. It gave me a reaction in the theater. But I mentioned this earlier, just a second ago, and it feeds really nicely into the screenplay, but the acting, more or less, here is kind of just a vessel for the story. So if you've seen any Christopher Nolan movies, you know that he is very high concept. He likes to do a lot of very interesting things with his stories, with his themes and his messages, and his overall narrative, and so that's to be expected here. He's kind of been upping the ante in every movie. Maybe take out Dunkirk there, because that's just kind of a biopic with a cool concept gimmick thing, but every movie has kind of been upping the stakes a little bit, and this movie is no exception. The story is very complex, and so a lot of the dialogue is more or less exposition. There's not a ton of emotional dialogue, save for Elizabeth Debicki's character. There is at least a little bit of exposition in almost every scene, which I didn't necessarily mind because of the fact that all of that exposition does not make it easier to follow. This movie is very difficult to understand. Part of that is from the concept, part of that is from something else that I will explain a bit later. Definitely my biggest pet peeve with the movie. But most of the characters are pretty much a straight man. There's not really any comic relief. There's not a ton of emotionality. Emotions? That's probably the word that I should be using, except for Elizabeth Debicki's character. So all the characters are very stoic. Very much you as an audience member are reflecting how you feel onto them, because almost all of it is just based around the progression of this story. There's a little bit of John David Washington being like confused and concerned at times, and he has one or two emotional outbursts, but this is very much an exposition plot heavy movie. And I will say that my favorite thing about this is the plot. I think this is one of Christopher Nolan's, if not his best concept. I think it is such an intriguing idea. And I keep saying the word cool. I think it's just a cool concept because it's not really explained in the trailer, nor is it explained in the synopsis. So I'm going to give a little bit more of an explanation if you're interested in hearing it. If not, I would skip about a minute or two ahead of this time signature, this time spot. But it's basically like somebody in the future, a scientist in the future, has created a device that can change the molecular structure of an object so that it looks to our eyes that it's moving backwards. So it's moving backwards in time and we're moving forwards in time. She realizes that this has the potential to end the world, so she decides to use this to set herself back in time and hide this device in the past. And there's 9 segments of this device. And so her past is our present. So that's like where we're at in the movie. And somebody is close to achieving or finding all 9. And so then they have the power to destroy the world, more or less. And so certain objects move in backwards in time. And then there's a certain point in the movie where characters can move backwards in time as well, based on a certain device that's represented with the colors blue and red. But I really liked this part because the structure of the movie then is basically the first half of the movie is us moving forward in time with John David Washington, and then at a certain spot, about halfway through, maybe about 2/3 of the way through, he starts to go backwards, and so we're seeing the same events of the movie, except we're moving backwards, and some of the things that didn't make sense in the beginning of the movie are starting to make sense based off of that. So it's a very cool structure. I think it's an awesome concept. At certain times, I think it gets a bit too complex for its own good. There are some moments where it might be a little convoluted to the point where you don't understand it. I kind of sat there. I would recommend not trying to understand it throughout the movie, just watching it. You can more or less understand what the goal of each scene is, and that's kind of where I ended my capacity for understanding it. Because time travel is hard to understand, regardless. And it doesn't really make sense if you think too hard about it. So if you just give it the benefit of the doubt, you're most likely going to get kind of almost everything that happens by the end of the movie. You can maybe try and create your own timeline if you want, try and figure it out, but you're going to understand the goals of each scene, and that's kind of how you have to enjoy the movie, because I just think the concept at large is a super cool idea to explore. So we're going to speed through some of the other stuff, because this is the stuff that is less interesting to me. The production design, the aesthetics of the mask, the not mask that we wear now from the pandemic, but like breathing masks. I think that's a cool aesthetic. I like that a lot. I think it also has some functionality in the story, so that works really well. It's just a really classy looking movie because of the fact that they're all wearing suits all the time, and I like how the gray color palette kind of complements that really well. I would have liked for there to be a bit more red and blue, because I like that as a color scheme, and it also symbolizes time really well, so it might have been easier to understand some spots, but I do think that gray looks pretty good as well. And then we go on to the cinematography. You can really feel the impact of the action in the camera work. So there's a scene in the beginning of the movie, or roughly the beginning of the movie, where John David Washington has to fight off a couple bad guys, mobsters, in a kitchen, and I really felt how hard he was hitting, and a lot of that was due to the shaky camera work, some of that was due to the editing and the sound design, but I just really felt the action, and I think that persists throughout the movie. I think the action is actually very solid. There are some spots where the editing is a bit choppy, but that's kind of what you can expect in any modern day action blockbuster. It's just easier to film that. The editing, the backwards effects looks great. It flows very naturally within the scene, especially when we get to those scenes where we're understanding why some things were moving backwards in the beginning of the movie. Ties things really nicely, and it doesn't feel out of place because of the world that's been established, and also that effect doesn't bleed anywhere else, so it feels sloppy. It just feels like a very controlled effect. It looks awesome. I will say something with the editing I didn't love as much is that some of the scenes end very abruptly. They don't give them some time to naturally come to a conclusion, and that makes the pacing feel a little bit choppy. It doesn't really flow as naturally as I would have wanted it to, but that doesn't set it back all that much, and I think some of that just comes from personal preference. And now we're going to get to the one thing that is the worst part of this movie, the big pet peeve that is setting it back, is that the sound design in this is absolutely terrible. This is something that Christopher Nolan has been doing for a couple years. It kind of started in The Dark Knight Rises. It works a little bit in Interstellar. It works a little bit in Dunkirk. Here it doesn't work at all. The audio is completely, or the dialogue is completely muffled by the score, which is a very intense, atmospheric, Inception type score, and all of the dialogue gets drowned out by it, and even when there are quiet scenes with the dialogue, it just is not mixed well. It feels muffled. So not only was I confused by some of the mechanics of the plot or the concepts of time travel, but I also couldn't hear them explaining it sometimes, and I thought that this might have been just the theater that I was in, but looking at some of other people's opinions, it looks like this was across the board. So the sound design does not work at all here. I really would have wished that this is not the route that he went. I would have wanted the mix to just sound a lot crisper, a lot cleaner. I think I would have enjoyed some of those scenes a bit more if I wasn't fumbling for the words there. The score is pretty good. It's a bit derivative of Hans Zimmer, but that is who Christopher Nolan had prior to this movie, and so I think it does work in regards to what Christopher Nolan's like tone and directional style is. And almost everything that I've talked about here is all Christopher Nolan, so the directing here is really great. He has a really great grasp of these concepts. He knows how to articulate them to the audience. I just wish that sound design was a bit cleaner, and I think this movie, so maybe the sound design a bit cleaner, and then a couple mechanics of the time travel that's a bit too complicated cut out, and this movie would have been perfect. It could have been like a 10 out of 10. I think this movie is awesome, barring those few exceptions, so I'm going to give this one a soft to solid, no, I'm going to give it a soft 8 out of 10. There are a few things that really set it back, and I would say that those things set it back a lot, but some of the other minor things don't set it back all that much, and I think it is still worth watching because of how charismatic those performances are and how interesting the story is, and I really, really enjoy the way it develops, and I think that if you're a fan of psychological thrillers or a fan of Christopher Nolan, you will as well. So that's Tenet. I had a great time watching it. If you're willing to go to the theaters, which I will talk about in a little bit, I definitely can recommend it to you as a first one back, or maybe a second one back if you've already been, but it's a fun one to watch in theaters for sure. So next up is my weekly watch, which is Batman Begins. And finally, my weekly recommendation is Memento, but make sure you stay tuned until that last segment, because I'm going to be talking about my experience at the movies, what the movies are like post-shutdown. Yeah, not post-pandemic, post-shutdown. So that's the episode. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review for Tenet. I'm now going to be going into my weekly watch, which is Batman Begins. And finally, my weekly recommendation of Memento. But make sure you stay tuned until that last segment, because I'm going to be running down what it's like to go to the movies post-shutdown. So right now is Batman Begins. This is a movie that I've never seen, actually. I've seen The Dark Knight. I saw Dark Knight Rises. I've seen almost every other Batman movie. I've also seen almost every other Nolan movie. And just somehow, I never got Batman Begins. I think it's because it came out so early. It was 2005. I also, little side note here, little vulnerable moment from the host. I have never, or not, okay, hold on a second. Not never. I hadn't seen the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies. I didn't grow up with them. They weren't my Spider-Man movies. The earliest Spider-Man movies that I watched were Andrew Garfield, which I will say I love, and I've said it before, they're wildly underrated and completely disrespected. But that's my tangent on early 2000s superhero movies. Thank you for listening. But Batman Begins, let's talk about that one that I hadn't seen. I did like this one. I didn't love it. I think I'm going to be I don't even think I'm going to be that harsh. I just think it's like kind of eh. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that we're so far past this now. Like, we're so much into complex superhero stories, and superhero movies have just far and away exceeded kind of what this movie did. But this is one of the movies that set that precedent. This is one of the movies that kind of created that idea. So I do want to give it credit for that, and there are a lot of great things about this movie, and I'm going to give it a pretty decent score because I did enjoy it. I just thought it was like a little boring at times, a little bit plain, especially compared to some of those other ones. I'm also not going to give a huge synopsis because I assume you guys know what it is. Bruce Wayne, his parents die. His parents get shot when he's young. He feels guilty about it, so he goes away in his mid to late 20s. Yeah, like mid-20s, maybe early 20s. I don't think they really explain it all that much. I think they say he's like in university, so early 20s. He goes away, gets arrested, gets trained by Ra's al Ghul, and then he comes back to Gotham to clean up the city, dressed like a bat, because he's scared of bats. So I enjoyed Batman Begins, but let's get into why. The acting here, Christian Bale has a great performance. I think Christian Bale's the best Batman. I think he's my favorite. I will say, though, that I think Batman is better and more interesting than Bruce Wayne. Well, definitely more interesting. I just don't think Bruce Wayne is written all that intriguingly in this movie. I do like the moments where he kind of switches on to that much more optimistic, charismatic version of him, and he does that in a couple scenes. They don't really set any precedent for that beforehand. I feel like he's a little bit missed out on that backstory. You kind of don't know why he's able to do that, why he's able to do the kind of happy-go-lucky thing. I like those moments a lot, and I think Christian Bale really pulls those off. I just think in the context of the story, it doesn't work as well, but that performance works for me. I think it's really enjoyable to watch, but I will say the Batman performance is just overall more interesting than Bruce Wayne is, and that's one thing that a lot of Batman movies lack. I think Bruce Wayne is a very interesting character in the comics. I think he has a lot of depth that is not explored in these movies. But Batman is a very cool performance. I really like the Christian Bale Batman voice. I know it's goofy, I know it's silly, but in watching this when I'm a little older, Batman is goofy and silly. Like, I know this is dark and gritty and it's supposed to take it seriously, but it's so wacky. Like these criminals are doing these very criminal things, and then he's like, whoosh! Like, it's just so much. And he's dressed in a Halloween costume. It's just very silly. So I like that the voice is kind of serious, kind of not. It's very tongue-in-cheek in that way. Everyone else, I think, takes a back seat in this movie. Nobody is bad by any means. I like Cillian Murphy a lot. He doesn't have too many moments in the movie, but I think he is pretty creepy, pretty menacing, especially in the moments where he's not Scarecrow. And I will say that I think my favorite character other than that is Falcone. I think Falcone does a really great job in this. He's also very menacing, and he has kind of a playful performance as well because he is just so in power. And then when he gets... Actually, I won't spoil it. Sorry. I'm not going to spoil anything if you haven't seen this 2005 very popular superhero movie. But he just has a lot of different layers that he gets to show off later on in the movie. I will say that. So let me get onto the screenplay. This is kind of the same note as everyone else taking a back seat. The focus is very much on Bruce Wayne in this movie. There's really nobody else other than Alfred, maybe, that has anything. Oh, Michael Caine does a great job. Michael Caine is so good. I don't know why I didn't mention that. But it's basically a Bruce Wayne story, which this is a reinvention of Batman from the 90s. It's a reinvention of Batman, period, but Batman had kind of gone into this route that a lot of people didn't like back in the 90s, so reintroducing everybody to the character, telling the audience what this version of the character is, I think is really important. So I am glad that it focused on Batman. The only thing that I think takes away from that, or what focusing on Batman takes away from the story, is that the villains, there's two in the movie, kind of come out of nowhere. Like, they kind of come out of left field. Ra's al Ghul, not so much, because he's established in the beginning, so having him somewhat come back in the end, I think makes a lot of sense. But before Bruce Wayne becomes Batman, there's no kind of, like, any indication that any other character would dress up in this very comic-y supervillain way, and so I think the justification behind Scarecrow does make sense. I think it's weird to have him come into play like at the same time as Batman. It feels very coincidental that it's like, oh, we're getting this silly supervillain at the same time we're getting this silly superhero. So that's a little strange, and I think that character just comes out of nowhere a little bit. So maybe take a little bit away from some, I don't know, like 10, 15 minutes of those opening scenes and make him come back to Gotham a little bit earlier. But then also maybe that would have ruined the Ra's al Ghul thing, because that's pretty well established. So that's just me. I think the Scarecrow bits are just a little out of place. I don't mind Scarecrow. I think the performance is really cool. I really like the effects that are with it. But I just think that comes out of left field a little bit. And then talking about Ra's al Ghul, I think a lot of things tie back really nicely in the movie. A lot of it's pretty predictable. I don't think the Ra's al Ghul reveal comes out of nowhere, particularly compared to Scarecrow. I also think that, okay, this is a little spoilery. It's not really all that important. So if you are worried, skip ahead about a minute. I do think that the reveal, quote unquote, of the fear toxin being the same one as Bruce Wayne carrying at the mountain is pretty obvious. I thought that was pretty predictable, so it doesn't really feel like as much of a reveal as I wish that it had. So some of those things that tie back are fairly predictable, and the other thing that is not predictable but just a bit obvious about the screenplay is just how hammered home the theme is. It's like the amount of times the word fear or scare or whatnot, something along those lines, is the entire time. It's just like, okay, we get it. This is the message of the movie. I kind of just wish that one character was focused on the whole fear thing and maybe not Ra's al Ghul, but just have it be in the beginning and then have it be Scarecrow. I think just Scarecrow's a better villain. I would have wished that it was focused on that. I also think it's just kind of strange that Liam Neeson is Ra's al Ghul because it's a very Asian character, but regardless, it was 2005. I guess I can't complain all that much. I just think that message is a bit shoved down your throat. As an audience member, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into, so that's kind of my other main critique for the story. The production design, I think I got to give a lot of credit to the production design of this movie, because a lot of what we view as Batman now, what Batman looks like, what his gadgets look like, what the world looks like, is designed from this movie. And I credit a lot of things to The Dark Knight, but this is the one that came first, and a lot of those things get improved upon or get added to in The Dark Knight or The Dark Knight Rises, but Batman Begins really set that precedent. So I think the design of all of the gadgets are extremely realistic in terms of how the world is being established. Also, the Batsuit looks pretty good. It doesn't feel terribly out of place. It does still feel silly. I think Batman always feels kind of silly, but I don't think it feels out of place by any means. I think it works, just because you can see the evolution of it. If anything, the pre-Batman suit looks looks sillier. It just looks so much weaker in context of the story. And then the Tumbler, oh my god, the Batmobile looks so cool. This is such a great design for the Batmobile, and everything is kind of trying, or at least the Ben Affleck Batman was kind of trying to model itself a little bit after that. I just don't think you can get away from the whole like industrial tank military grade looking mobile after this movie. This is what kind of set that, and it looks awesome. And then this is a little bit more visual effects based, but I think Gotham makes a lot of sense. I like how the mansion and the train look a little bit higher end than everything else in Gotham. I thought that the beginning CGI of the city was a bit better than the end CGI. I don't think that the city, like the wide shots, I thought this was kind of strange. The wide CGI shots of the city that are kind of like establishing shots look a little gummy. Like, they don't look great at the end of the movie. And I would give it a pass because of how early the visual effects are, but visual effects could do buildings pretty well by this point. And the train sequence, like when you are looking at the train and the Wayne Enterprise is building at the beginning of the movie, or I guess middle beginning of the movie, looks a lot better. And that's also kind of an establishing landscape-based thing. And even Gotham looks pretty good in those shots. So it looks weird in low light, looks pretty good in highlight. That's not the word. Daylight. But everything else, I think the visual effects look awesome. Scarecrow is very cool. I think it's a little bit kind of like the shaky cam is not overused, but just a little bit silly nowadays. But everything else, I think I had seen a lot of screen caps from this movie because of just how I had missed it for so long. So like I had seen sort of the bats coming out of Scarecrow's mouth, or the Scarecrow mask with the maggots on it. But the one that I hadn't seen is the fear toxin version of Batman, where he's kind of like dripping gunk out of his mouth, and then the entire mask is black. There's no semblance of any humanity behind it. That looked great. That looked very creepy. I liked the design of that a lot. So I think the visual effects on the Scarecrow and the fear toxin look fantastic and add a little bit of a comic-y feel into this very gritty movie. And so then along with cinematography, because that's kind of part of the visual effects for those scenes, I didn't love the fight scenes in the beginning of this movie. You really can't tell what's going on, even more so than I think a bunch of other action movies. So kind of mentioned this in Tenet. I'm sure I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but a big tactic of action movies nowadays is to use a bunch of shaky cam and a bunch of cuts to symbolize and project that there is a lot of intensity going on. There's a lot of punches being thrown without having to do all of the work of the choreography, or just a lot of the grueling work of it and timing everything correctly. So it's just a little bit easier, and you can still get the point across. There's just so many cuts in this, and the shaky cam is way more intense than some other movies, so I really can't tell any of the action that's going on in the beginning of the movie in the temple with Ra's al Ghul. I think that works better when he gets back to Gotham, because Batman is supposed to be this very elusive character. You're not supposed to be able to see where he's coming from, what he's doing, and so the fight scenes there actually make a lot of sense, and I think the fight scene with Ra's al Ghul at the end looks a little bit better because it's just two characters, but when he's fighting a big mob of people, it's like a ton of cuts around. So it doesn't work in the beginning. It works narratively, thematically in the middle. I just don't like it. I would have preferred to be able to see what was going on, and the final fight scene at the end kind of improves upon that as well. The rest of the cinematography works really well, especially in low light, because this movie is almost exclusively done in low light. When you get to Gotham, you can see pretty much everything that's going on, and you get a really solid sense that Gotham has its own character. Gotham is a character in this movie. You can tell that it's different from other cities that you've seen, and it's a very big part of both the production design and then also just the overall narrative. So I'm glad that you're able to see that pretty well. The score is Hans Zimmer, and I think I take this score for granted because the Batman theme from all three of these movies is pretty iconic. It's pretty memorable, too. I don't think it's one of those things where if you told somebody on the street, you're like, hey, can you do the Batman theme from the Christopher Nolan movies? I don't think they'd be able to pick it like from the top of their head, but it's one of those things that is instantly recognizable. And one of the things that is glossed over in big movies like this is that the score can be good, but if it's not memorable, it's not going to have as much rewatchability, and you're not going to be able to kind of like do anything in the next movies with it if you don't have some sense of like, oh, that's the character that I'm following. That's one thing that I think Marvel has done poorly. There aren't a lot of character themes, save for the Avengers theme, which is extremely memorable and is fantastic and is one of the best movie scores ever. But the Batman theme sounds great. I think everything else is a bit redundant, kind of similar. So that theme is awesome, and there are some other themes that sound really good too, but I just really wanted to mention that. And the sound design sounds really natural. All of the punches also have just like a very wet, thick sound, so that works extremely well for Batman and just how brutal this world is. And then the directing. It's Christopher Nolan. He really knows what he's doing. This is post-Memento, so this is kind of like this is really what set him off, because he did Memento, which gave him the ability to do this, and then it's like, boom, Christopher Nolan. And that kind of, it just sets up how solid of a filmmaker he is. You're really not going to go wrong with any of his movies. You might have some preferences. There might be some things that lack, but this is just such a solid movie. If anything, maybe it's a little bit long, a little bit dull at times, but I think that's also just compared to more modern superhero movies. So I'm going to give Batman Begins a soft 7 out of 10. I didn't have the heart to give it a 6. I just think it does so much for the genre. It sets up so many great things, both Batman-wise and superhero-wise, and I just think overall it's a pretty solid movie, just didn't strike me in any particular way. So that's Batman Begins. I can recommend it if you haven't seen it. If not, if you haven't seen it, or if you have seen it, sorry. If you have seen the movie, I don't know if I'd recommend going back to it. I don't think that I'm going to rewatch it anytime soon. But if you're a big Batman fan, go check it out again. Have some fun. But that's Batman Begins. Stay tuned for the next segment where I talk about Memento, my weekly recommendation, my favorite Christopher Nolan movie. And then stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I just talk about the movies, what it's like to go back. It's very exciting. But that's the episode, and right now we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews for Tenet and Batman Begins. I'll now be talking about my weekly recommendation of Memento, and stay tuned until that last segment where I talk about the movies, talking about what it's like to go back to the movies after all of this shutdown craziness. But right now is Memento. And full disclosure, I haven't seen Memento in a very long time, probably a couple years, but I love this movie. I absolutely adore it. I think it is by far my favorite Christopher Nolan movie. I would say it's up there with his best. Maybe it's not his most refined movie, but not his most polished movie because of the fact that it's so early in his career. This is actually the movie that basically got him the gig of Batman. It kind of put him on the map. He had one or two movies before that I think underground scene, film festival scene knew about. People liked it, and then Memento really took off. So Memento basically follows Leonard, played by Guy Pearce, who after a traumatic event where his wife was brutally raped and killed, he was also left with a condition that causes him to not be able to create new short-term memories. So he has only created memories up to the point of the home invasion, to the attack, and he has now dedicated his life to finding the killer and seeking justice for his wife. But because he can't create new memories, he has to tattoo all of the clues onto his body. So right off the bat, an extremely creative, intriguing premise. The lead character is played by Guy Pearce, who has a really layered performance. Christopher Nolan, especially early on in his career, I think less so now. I kind of mentioned how I think Christopher Nolan is not quite as good as he once was, in my opinion. Again, very much personal opinion here. So that's just kind of what I think. But I think early on in his career, he had very layered main characters, very nuanced protagonists that have a lot of emotional turmoil. They're going through a lot of baggage that we have, as the audience, have to discover. And this is no exception. Guy Pearce really portrays that excellently. The thing that he also portrays really well is kind of the mental state that Leonard is in. So he has both this level of confusion and rage that are always present in his performance. It's just a matter of which one is more useful in that scene and which one is going to overpower the other. So there are some scenes where they're somewhat similar, but most of the scenes, I think most of the high stakes scenes are basically very confused. Yes, he's very confused. And the more intense scenes in the beginning and the end of the film is where that anger takes over. And there are some scenes where they kind of go back and forth. But he really just is able to walk that line in a way where we can still feel sympathetic for him and also be kind of afraid of him, for him. There's just a lot of different things going on with this Guy Pearce performance, which I really loved. And I mentioned the beginning and end of the film, so I kind of want to talk about the structure, because that's another thing that is very creative about this movie. It's kind of the thing the movie is known for. So the premise is already intriguing. I think it's a very high concept movie about the idea of tattooing it on your body. But the thing that is most memorable, most intriguing about this movie is that it's kind of told backwards. Now, Christopher Nolan had the idea that he wanted to get the audience in the mindset of somebody with this kind of short-term memory loss, to not really ever know what's going on, to be very disoriented by a scene or by an event. So what he does is that when every scene, so the movie is told backwards, kind of. It's not reversed. It's not like you're rewinding a tape. I know people don't rewind tapes anymore, so sorry. But every scene that starts, we don't know the precursor to that scene. And then that scene will play out chronologically, and then there'll be kind of a break. There's a black and white scene in between those, which I'll talk about in just a second. But then we'll see a scene that preceded the one that we just saw. And so we'll get some answers to the previous scene of what was going on. And then we'll also have even more questions about what's going on. So then it goes backwards. So the black and white scenes, more or less a long phone call with Leonard, where he's learning about Sammy Jenkins. He's hearing a story of Sammy Jenkins, a man that he met in his past life prior to the accident, or the incident, it's not really an accident, who had a similar mental condition to what he had. And all of that is told chronologically. So if you're going to look at the structure of the story, all of the events of the black and white happen first, and then the end of the movie is going backwards. So both of them are kind of leading to a midpoint. And the way that the movie works is that the midpoint is then the climax. And that works extremely well because there's a reveal at the end of this movie that satisfies both the arc of the black and white story, but then also the arc of the backwards main narrative. So it's able to create a climax that works on both levels in that way, both chronologically and backwards. Is final, it feels very complete, and it's also shocking. It's an amazing twist in this movie. It's probably my favorite twist in any movie. And that structure also sets up the ability to create these very intriguing little scenes. So I would say that the scene work, I kind of mention scene work a lot because sometimes the scene work is just overall better than the main story, or the like arc of a scene is just more interesting than the arc of the total movie. But this one works in such a different level because we just have no context for the scene most of the time. We don't know where we are, we don't know what's happening, and so getting the chance to actually just watch the scene with really no precursor to anything else except for the scene prior to it, or that's even just like answering a question from before, it's not actually really adding any context all that much to the scene at hand, creates for some really interesting scenes. One of my favorite ones is where he's on the phone in the black and white, and he is talking on the phone, and there's a tattoo that is being healed, so it's a bandage, and he takes it off, and it kind of reveals something about the thing that's happening right now, and it's a really shocking revelation. Just like, it's not the main twist of the movie, it's just a brief little revelation, and I think that moment is probably one of my favorite scenes ever, realistically. So I just really love the way that the structure fits the overall like narrative. And the dialogue obviously is great too, but I think the structure is just the most important aspect here and creates for a really dynamic screenplay. The production design is also really excellent here because of the fact that the tattoos are just such an original idea. I know this is kind of minor. I feel like a lot of people wouldn't take this into account, but the font of the tattoos really works. It's different, it's diverse, but it also just like fits the style of the movie and just adds a layer to this film that shows how much everybody who made this movie cares about it, how much time and effort was taken to make it. I also think the production design, like costuming, is really memorable. It doesn't really stand out to me as far as like what the aesthetic decision was, like what that symbolizes. But for example, Guy Pearce's costume that he's taken from a different character, that's sort of this like light blue this light blue shirt, button-down shirt, and then gray, or I guess it's a tan jacket. I'm forgetting. This is my short-term memory loss. But that costume it just doesn't seem like the obvious decision, which is another kind of point in its favor. It works really well, but it's just super memorable. I think it's a really excellent costume choice. I don't know who made that decision for that specific costume, but I really, really love it. And the tattoos obviously fit extremely well as well. The cinematography does a wonderful job putting us in the shoes of our characters. So the structure kind of sets that up. But for a lot of the scenes, we are following Guy Pearce's character, Leonard, but the camera's also functioning in a way where it's taking into account everything else in the scene. So he is looking around to kind of add context clues, and the camera work does that as well. So we are really put into the shoes of Leonard because we don't know what's going on. So we're following the camera really intricately, and the camera's really showing us what we're supposed to be looking at. And that really helps add context to a scene as well as add weight to this character and to this story. So the cinematography just works in tandem with the screenplay expertly, honestly. And then going into the editing, this is kind of screenplay, so I'm glad that I mentioned that. I kind of wanted to talk about it in screenplay, but there's a voiceover in this movie for a lot of it. And a lot of times voiceovers can just feel lazy, feel gimmicky. Maybe not gimmicky, it's just used so often, it just feels like an easy cop-out to get into the mind of the main character. And in this one, we really need that. We need to have at least a little bit of context because we have none. And so I actually think that the voiceover, this is one of the best uses of voiceover in a movie because we really need to understand the confusion of this character. And we're trying to add context at the same time that he is. And it also adds for some great comedy. There's some really great comedic moments because he doesn't know what's happening, and then he's like, oh, this is what's happening. And we're realizing it at the same time that he is. So I think the voiceover is used really, really well here. And with this confusing structure, it's really important to have concise pacing. I talk about pacing a lot, and sometimes pacing can be somewhat ambiguous as long as the flow works. But in this one, there's such a clear-cut structure of one timeline moving backwards, one timeline moving forwards. And so everything has to not only flow naturally, but make sense to a viewer within the cuts so that we can kind of understand what's going on. And the way that it's paced is really nice because the longer scenes that are moving backwards, They are longer. I know that I just said that, but they're the ones that are longer. They're the bulk of the scene. And to keep that flow going of we got to go backwards, we still want the scene to move forwards, but the narrative has to move backwards, buffering it with this other story, these other scenes, completes the pacing in such a holistic way, because not only does it give us a break from the main narrative and lets us know that, okay, the next scene is going to be something very different from beforehand, but it also kind of slows down the pacing. It makes this movie much more of a slow burn. We have to figure out what's going on, which in a psychological thriller is extremely, extremely important. And then we get to the sound. The score here isn't super memorable, but you can see that it's going to get there. You can see that this is what Christopher Nolan kind of wants as a tone for his movie. It's very symphonic. It's very similar to a lot of other orchestral music scores. But the thing that's a little bit different is it does feel similar to what he does in his next few movies and kind of all over the place. It's just like these very low, deep, resounding tones that kind of sustain for a very long time to create very ominous atmosphere. And the score does that really, really well. I think this movie is just a fantastic example of what makes Christopher Nolan so special. He just has such a fantastic grasp of a story, and then the best way to tell that story that keeps the audience guessing the entire time. And he really trusts his audience in a lot of his movies. Sometimes maybe he trusts them a bit too much, like in Tenet, where I didn't know what was going on half the time. But I think he does give the audience the benefit of the doubt. He doesn't spoon feed any real narrative information to us. He might spoon feed some of the exposition of the mechanics of things, but as far as like what's going on in the plot, he doesn't overtly tell us. So he really trusts his audience, which is a really important thing for a filmmaker to do. And he just has such a solid semblance of everything that fits into these really complex movies. And I think Memento is just a prime example of that and shows that he'd been doing it from the start. So I love Memento. It's not only one of my favorite Chris Nolan movies, it's also just one of my favorite movies ever, one of my favorite psychological thrillers. So I'm going to give this movie a strong 9 out of 10. Memento is absolutely fantastic. If you haven't seen it, highly, highly recommend it. And those are the movies. So that's Tenet, Batman Begins, and Memento. This final segment is going to be a bit shorter than usual. I just wanted to talk about my movie-going experience, tell you what it's like to go to the movies. It's not all that different necessarily, but that's what that final segment is going to be. So make sure you stick around for that, because right now we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I've just given my reviews of Tenet, Batman Begins, and Memento. And now, we're just going to take a little break. We're going to relax a little bit. This is not going to be a very long segment. I just wanted to talk to you about my movie-going experience. So what it was like going to the movies post-shutdown. Obviously, we're still in the midst of COVID-19, still in the middle of the pandemic, so definitely be cautious, be aware of who you are, how you feel about your surroundings, how you feel about your area, based on the people that might be going, or more so the amount of people that you think might be going. And so if you don't have the chance to go or want to hear what it's like before you go, I thought that I would just do that for you guys today, because I was going to do like a top 5 Chris Nolan movies, but I reviewed 3 of them, and there's like, I don't know, 9 or 10. So I thought that would be kind of redundant, kind of unnecessary. And I had a really great time going to the movies, and I was going to maybe talk about it at the beginning of the Tenet review, but I knew that I wanted that full 15 minutes to talk about Tenet. So let's just talk about the movies. So I live in Philadelphia right now, and so near me there are 2 AMCs. There's an AMC Broad Street and AMC Center City. I forget what it's like, theater. It's like a sit down. There's like food there. I've only been a couple times, so I go to the Broad Street one, and it's within walking distance. So I, first of all, could not stop thinking about it all day. I know this is very dorky, but I had not been to a movie in the theaters since March. The last movie I saw in theaters, for context, was Onwards. I mean, obviously this is not like original. A lot of people were in the same boat, but this is something that I went to the movies probably 2 times a week, at least once a week. And so I haven't done that in so long. And so I was like giddy all day. I was so ready to go to the movies. And okay, first of all, side note, I thought that the movies were $3. Turns out I just had some like rewards points from AMC that I had not cashed in yet. So I guess a lot of people are at AMC. So the tickets are still normal price. Right now in theaters, it's basically Tenet, The New Mutants, Broken Hearts Gallery just came out, which I would like to check out soon. Oh, by the way, since the movies are back, I'm now going to start to review some of those in-theater movies. I felt very safe going, and so I fully intend on still going, maybe once a week, maybe not like every week, but I'm going to try and go as often as possible. And so I got a ticket for 8:15, decided to head out like 7:55. And walked over, had my mask on. I was a little nervous because I have not worked since the pandemic started, and so I haven't had to like wear a mask for a very long period of time. Every time that I've worn a mask, I've really only gone to go get errands or something like that, and so the longest probably is like 2 hours maybe. And Tenet is obviously like, it's like a 2.5-hour movie. It's a very long movie, plus like 30 minutes of trailers, plus walking time and waiting beforehand. So I had to have the mask on for 3.5, maybe 4 hours. And I was a little bit worried about that. But what's really nice is that you're not moving around. You're not going anywhere, obviously. And so at a certain point, I kind of forgot that I was wearing a mask, which was great. But I got to the theater, and there are very few people working there. I assume most of this like is across the board, probably, for a lot of AMCs and probably just a lot of theaters regardless. So very few people working there. I didn't go get concessions. I wouldn't recommend going to get concessions because that's definitely a bit more human contact than I would prefer going on right now. I know there are some deals. I think you can get certain things for like $5, which is definitely tempting. And maybe the more I go, I might see less people, or I might see how safe that they're being behind the scenes, behind the counter. And so if that's the case, maybe I'll try and get some popcorn, because I do miss movie theater popcorn, but I didn't get it this time because there's only a few people working. But the person working at the like ticket scanner where I went to go, because I got it online, obviously I would recommend doing that as well. There's very few very cheap digital fees, which they might have even waived. I'm a part of like the rewards membership, so they waive that no matter what. And if you're close to a movie theater and want to keep going to the movies, definitely recommend doing that. But they have like a glass screen up, which is very common right now, and so got it scanned, went into the theater. And what's really nice is that AMC, some theaters are doing 30% capacity, or some showings are doing 30% capacity, and some are doing 40% capacity. I think for those bigger movies, those bigger theaters, that's 40%. And so mine was 40%. And that basically equates to 3, maybe 4 people a row. And when you buy your ticket, it automatically blocks off the 2 seats next to you, which is really excellent. Because even if I was sitting next to somebody, which some movie theaters I think have been doing, I know there's a video of Tom Cruise going to go see Tenet, and I think he's around a lot of people. But anyway, even if I was that close, the chairs are fairly big. This is pretty standard for AMC. And I would probably have still felt pretty safe as long as everyone had their masks on, which are obviously required. But it automatically blocks those 2 seats off. And what was really nice for me is that I got the top row, which kind of has a break in the middle for some handicap seating. And so I was all alone in my row. I had basically like 4 seats that were kind of near me. And so I didn't have to worry about anybody. I kept my mask on the entire time. It seemed as though everybody else did as well. And I expected this, but there's a little thing in the beginning of the movie, right before, like with all the AMC credits and stuff that tells you all of the community guidelines, and it's basically just like keep your mask on unless you're eating or drinking. So that's another reason why I wouldn't recommend getting concessions, because not only is a mask helpful, obviously, for everybody else around you, but it's also for yourself, and so you don't want to put anybody else at risk. If you have been in contact with somebody that you don't know about, it's just obviously better to have that mask on anyway, so I wouldn't recommend those concessions, because then you can keep that mask on the entire way. And a 2.5-hour movie is really the longest movie you're going to get. I wouldn't recommend going to a movie longer than that right now, and I think it's relatively unnecessary most of the time when a movie's that long, but that's just my opinion. Tenet is more or less the longest movie you're going to get, and I really forgot that I had my mask on at a certain point, and I have a pretty thick mask that kind of tugs at the back of my ears sometimes and can give me a headache, but because I wasn't moving around and I was solely focused on the screen and didn't have to keep readjusting my mask, I totally forgot about it, which made the viewing experience that much better. Just felt like I was back in the theaters, and honestly, I kind of think it was better because there was no one around me. I didn't have to deal with that. And I know some people don't love going to the movies alone. I think the stigma against that should go away. I love going to the movies alone. It's one of my favorite things to do. It's just so peaceful. It's so calming. And I would watch a movie at my house by myself. Why can't I go to the movies alone? And it's also kind of hard to sit with people now. Anyway, I think that if you get 2 seats that block out in the middle and you've been quarantining with somebody, I don't think they police it all that much, all that hard. So I'm sure you can probably sit next to them. And I would expect, I've only been to this one movie. Maybe this won't be the case in the future. I'll let you guys know. I wouldn't expect anybody to be sitting next to you. I think everyone is more or less just as worried as you would be going to the movies. And so I can fully endorse going to the movies, especially for a movie like Tenet. I think that's one of those movies that really benefit from seeing it in the theaters. You might be able to understand it a little better at home with some subtitles, but I don't think it's available for purchase or for digital right now. So I would recommend going to go see Tenet if you feel comfortable, if you feel safe. I also think that within the first, so it's been 2 weeks since my theaters opened. I think a lot of other theaters opened much earlier though. So if you're in one of those cities that opened up like the end of July or end of August, I would assume that not too many people are going at this point. I'm thinking that 30%, 40% capacity is going to stay, but at the same time, it might not even fill up that much because of the fact that the novelty of movies might go away after a while, or people are still going to be concerned. So if you're really concerned about people, obviously don't go. It's not necessarily worth it to go see the movies that are out right now, but there are some good ones coming out in the future, and I definitely feel as though it was very safe. I will keep you guys posted if anything like that changes. If I feel as though it isn't safe one time that I go or whatnot, I will totally update everybody, because I know this is something that lots of people enjoy, especially if you're listening to this. And it really brought me a lot of joy that night. So I want everyone to experience that as well. I want everyone to go back to the movies when they feel safe and comfortable. And I can say that right now, at least for AMC, everything felt very safe, felt very nice, and I can recommend going. But that was my movie theater experience. I thought I would just run it down for you guys because I know some of you are not able to go to the movies right now, or don't know if you want to go to the movies, or if you want to just live vicariously through my movie theater going experience, we can do that as well. But I had a fun time talking about this episode. I loved going back to the movies, and I really loved seeing Tenet. Maybe the reason I liked it more is because it was just like the most recent movie in theaters, and I was just so excited to be back. But regardless, loved that one, and I just loved being back at the movies. So I really had a great time in this episode. And I hope that you did as well. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to remind you to please subscribe to the show if you haven't already. If you could leave us a nice review, that would be great. That really helps us out. And also, if you could follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. And have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.